Final Fantasy IV, also known as Final Fantasy II in North America, is one of the most discussed games of the 16-bit era. Final Fantasy IV is what most would refer to as a classic Japanese role-playing game, setting the standard for many JRPGs that would follow. Early JRPGs took influence from Western RPGs, but with anime-inspired art design, and in FF4's case, simplified mechanics, making it more approachable to casual gamers. Western RPGs tend to mimic Dungeons & Dragons in regards to both world building and gameplay. The world of a Western RPG will contain elements of medieval, Tolkien-inspired fantasy, and the leveling system is based upon the player's choice. Final Fantasy IV is not entirely different in that it contains knights, dwarves, dragons, and such, many of the usual suspects. But the player does not decide upon the class of the character, or how to distribute the experience points. There is no choice in leveling up. When the player discovers a new weapon or piece of armor, it is often unequivocally better than the previous equipment, although there are a few items with elemental attributes that require some level of decision-making. Final Fantasy IV improves upon previous games in the series by creating unique and memorable characters, and though it simplifies the leveling system from the job-based system of Final Fantasy III, which was not initially released in the US, its template for experience growth became a standard for many games in the genre. Characters grow dependent on their class, which is built into the personality of the character and cannot be changed. The path throughout the world is carved out neatly by the story, and I most recently finished the game in about 20 hours. There's some in-game stuff to do, but only a few insane completionist activities, upon whose merit I will discuss later. Final Fantasy IV was released in North America as Final Fantasy II in 1991, in order to avoid confusion about the missing titles that never made it across seas. After many rentals at a local Blockbuster Video in the early 90s, I finally bought a used copy that I own to this day at a now extinct brick-and-mortar store called MediaPlay. If you're going to play Final Fantasy IV now, it might be more accessible to play the 3D remake on Steam, in which the graphics are 3D polygons instead of 2D sprites. These titles are given distinction with the labels FF4 2D and FF4 3D. There is something I personally find more charming about the sprite art of the original over the polygon art of the 3D remake, though I've purchased the remake on Steam and intend on playing it at some point. There is even Final Fantasy IV: The After Years, an episodic title that takes place 17 years after the game's original story. I have yet to play the Final Fantasy IV Pixel Remaster, though it does appear to be pretty accurate. My one complaint at first glance would be that I don't like the look of the in-game font. The 2D Super Nintendo version of Final Fantasy IV has been heavily altered from the original Japanese Super Famicom release. The most significant changes include, but are not limited to, removal of some items, removal of some character abilities, naming simplification for items, spells, and enemies, different item prices in stores, increased visibility for secret passages in dungeons, and different layouts for towns to include training rooms. These changes were likely made to create a more accessible experience for American players who were unaccustomed to JRPGs. The game's script was censored in places due to a concern for younger gamers, and the translation can be rough. Still, the game's story is not too difficult to follow, though the dialogue during character interactions does come across as somewhat stilted. For a quick look at the game's censorship, note how the dancing girl in the Japanese version tosses off her dress to reveal a bikini underneath, whereas in the American version, she is simply wearing a leotard. The dancing girl routines in each town are something of an Easter egg, culminating in this magnificent burlesque scene in the Kingdom of Troya. The American release made the game easier in multiple ways. Status ailments can usually wreck your party if gone untreated, poison being the most basic, a slow drain on your HP, or paralyze, which completely stops a character from acting, or even worse, charm, which causes a character to fight against the party. This one can be a real problem if it's a powerful character. In the original, different status ailments required different items to heal them, while in the American version, a single item can be used to heal any status. These items are also significantly cheaper. However, the US version also removes items that can increase your overall stats: silver apples, golden apples, and soma drops. Another difference I've always noticed was the change from KO status to swoon, which just sounds silly. Final Fantasy IV is the first in the series to use an active time battle, or ATB system. In the original Final Fantasy for the NES, all 4 characters' actions will be decided upon first, followed by an exchange of blows that the player would watch unfold. The battles in FF4 are still turn-based, but time does not stop for the player to make their decision, as in the original. This makes it important to select a character's action as quickly as possible each time their turn arrives. It allows for combat to flow much more naturally than in FF1. In the original release of FF4, you cannot see any indication that a character's next turn is arriving, but in the Game Boy Advance version, an ATB bar in the battle window is visually represented, filling at a rate of speed specific to the character. Also, in the original release, the player does not have the option to change characters in and out. The final party is all decided for you based upon the story. The GBA version added the option to bring old characters back at the end, also adding a 40-floor post-game dungeon with new weapons, armor, and items. I've played the original SNES release, the PS1 release, and the original with an improvement patch to create an experience closer to the original Japanese version, including a cleaned-up English translation. There's also a version I've never played called Final Fantasy IV Easy Type, which ironically makes some of the late-game enemies more difficult. It did make the game easier by reducing casting time for spells. This version was exclusive to Japan and followed the US release. It kept some of the changes from the US version intact, such as spells being numbered instead of using suffixes, while adding back in silver and golden apples. It also includes some unique weapons, such as Piglet's bamboo sword and the coral sword. It even changed the graphics of the endgame boss. The following PlayStation 1 port is a port of the original with some quality of life improvements from the American release and FF4 Easy Type. The WonderSwan Color version was only available in Japan, but it was ported into the Game Boy Advance version here in the States. I will highlight some differences between these versions, although it's not my sole intent to comprehensively study these changes. I'm more concerned with examining the interlocking progression of gameplay and story, and why it remains so compelling to me 30 years later. I believe the strongest aspects of Final Fantasy IV are its direction by Hironobu Sakaguchi, who directed the first 5 games in the series, its character design by Yoshitaka Amano, who took lead on the first 6 games, and its music by Nobuo Uematsu, who composed all of the music for the first 9 games in the series, and a diminishing amount of music in the following entries. There's a reason these are the first 3 names during the end credits. The first thing that I take note of upon booting up the game is the iconic title theme. The original prelude is an arpeggiated melody that evokes a sense of mystique and wonder. This being the first Final Fantasy title for a 16-bit system, received a fully upgraded title theme. The composition is expanded with a soaring lead melody, suggesting that we, the player, are about to embark upon an epic adventure. I love the prelude theme of Final Fantasy so much that often I will not make it past the title screen to even play the game, because I'm so completely enthralled by this music. The Red Wings theme that opens the game up is equally perfect, both regal and sinister. The battle theme is also a straight-up bop. A major portion of the game takes place in battle, and this driving music is still some of the best in the series. It gets stuck in my head more than any other music in the game, likely because battles are so frequent here. The boss theme is also killer. It incorporates such a great dramatic melody atop a pulsating bass line. That's not even to mention the classic victory music. I'll go into detail more about specific music as I dig deeper into the game's substance. As a large portion of the game takes place in battle, it will be helpful to go into detail in regards to this system. I would divide the gameplay loop into plot progression, exploration of dungeons and towns, inventory management, and battle. The battle system is relatively simple. There are front and back rows which alter the amount of damage characters will give or receive. Therefore, it's recommended to move magic users or characters wielding long-range weapons to the back, as their attacks will not be affected, and close combat fighters like Cecil and Kain with high hit points to the front. This holds true for most Final Fantasy games. There are also front and back rows for the enemies, which I did not understand and use to my advantage until this playthrough of the game as an adult. I don't think this applied to the original American release though. There are no skill trees, and characters will simply gain stat boosts and new spells at predetermined levels. Characters also each start with abilities that can be used free of consuming magic points, though as previously mentioned, some are missing from the Super Nintendo release. This means that there is very little character customization at work here, which is acceptable for me in a game that is very much story-driven. The magic attacks are mostly elemental-based. There are tried and true methods at work here that every Final Fantasy veteran has an inherent understanding of. Using lightning will defeat a water enemy or anything mechanical. Fire or even a healing spell will defeat an undead enemy. Ice will defeat a reptile or anything that has flame in the name. When elemental magic fails, use bio. I am quite fond of the soundbite when the bio spell connects. If an enemy casts a wall on themselves to reflect magic back, summon magic is not affected. If you have a wall cast on you, cast magic on yourself to reflect it back on an enemy. The active time battle system creates many opportunities for failure. Sometimes you're trying to cure a character and then they're killed, resulting in an ineffective cure. Sometimes you're trying to heal a status ailment and it goes away naturally, resulting in a wasted spell. Kain is often in the air and misses out on healing, but also avoids being attacked this way. I've learned a little more about the interplay of these mechanics each time I've played through the game, and there are always elements of timing that alter the predictability of any given outcome. The enemy variety here is pretty strong, though there are a lot of palette-swapped enemies. The floating eye enemy from the opening battle might be one of the game's most iconic. Of course, there's everything from bats and crocodiles to undead dragons and behemoths. We've got sandworms out of Dune, gorgons, hydras, and chimeras out of Greek myth, and the manticore out of Persian myth. We've also got snake ladies, spider ladies, and vampire ladies. There are even a few robot enemies later on when the game goes in a more sci-fi direction. There is a high encounter rate in some dungeons which might result in frustration, although this is par for the course with JRPGs of the time, and this isn't even the worst example. The challenge inherently lies in the format of the random battle system. Rather than the setup of an action RPG where enemies can be seen and attacked, here the player is taken to a different screen where battle takes place over the course of several minutes. By the time the player is returned to the board game-esque map screen, it can be difficult to remember which direction you are traveling in, and with the layout of some dungeons containing floor after floor of similar looking tiles, it can become confusing and disorienting, especially when all you're trying to do is get a lay of the land and you keep encountering enemies. That being said, these dungeons are actually pretty straightforward compared to other games in the genre. It's no coincidence that there were always strategy guides for sale and hint lines you could call back in the day before the internet. It's not that enemies exist on certain tiles either. There is a rate of chance that you will get into a battle every time you step on a tile. These percentages are higher in some areas than others. Anyone who has ever played an old school JRPG knows the frustration of getting out of a long drawn-out battle just to take a single step and get into the exact same battle again. I always embark upon my adventure swearing I will maintain the perseverance to fight through every random encounter. But at some point, I've lost my way, 5 floors deep in the Tower of Babel at 2 o'clock in the morning, and as soon as my mind can process the weird screen distortion and audio cue, my fingers are already firmly laid upon L and R to get the hell out of there. I also developed a technique in which I would take one step at a time and pause in between each step, because I thought I would get into fewer battles that way. Sometimes I would walk in a line and pause for a few seconds every time I turned. I have a childhood memory of my brother watching me play this game and expressing much annoyance at my painfully slow progress through the level. Playing it now, it does allow for more time to let the game's music soak in, which restarts on a loop after every battle, so you often hear the former part of the loop much more than the latter. So yeah, take your time while you're going through the level just to hear that great music. In order to explore the game's story and characters, it's necessary to venture into spoilers for all of the plot twists, story beats, character deaths, and the ending. That being said, I was able to beat it in about 20 hours, so it's actually paced well and very approachable. The story of Final Fantasy IV is not entirely unique, but its presentation contains a depth uncommon for RPGs of its time. What is actually more interesting than the plot itself is the wide array of characters and their distinct personalities, be they NPCs or party members encountered throughout. There are 12 playable characters, but only a specific endgame party of 5, meaning there's not much point in level grinding until the story approaches its conclusion. The first time playing, you might not know this and waste hours of your life level grinding characters who will only die, become injured, exploded, turned into stone, become swallowed by a sea monster, or just flat out betray you. There's also more strategy required when approaching the game not over-leveled. It's already not too difficult, and I find it more enjoyable to maintain a determined pace and drive along the narrative. Final Fantasy IV is a classic telling of the hero's journey and the struggle between good and evil, packed full of medieval fantasy genre tropes. When I first played this game, I had never read The Lord of the Rings. I knew nothing of Arthurian legend. Now I consider it to be more classic, while every Final Fantasy game since has significantly changed the art design, world building, storylines, characters, and battle systems. There is the exception that there are some reoccurring monsters like the Malboro, and there is usually a character named Cid, who is often, though not always, an airship engineer, first appearing in the Japanese Final Fantasy II, though the first playable Cid is here in Final Fantasy IV. He is introduced early on, but not playable until later. The story begins as our protagonist, the Dark Knight Cecil, is commanding the Red Wings, the aerial branch of the Kingdom of Baron. There is an option later to change characters' names by talking to a rabbit-like creature called Namingway, if that is how you prefer to experience an RPG. But these characters have such distinct personalities, I've chosen for the names to remain as they are. Because of voice acting, this option is removed from the 3D remake. I will also mention that the Amano character sketches are gorgeously expressive renditions of these now beloved characters. Cecil has been tasked with invading the world's nations and taking their crystals by force. The crystals represent the elements of earth, water, wind, and fire, and the balance of power throughout the world, with each major kingdom possessing one. There are also dark crystals underground, and even crystals on the moon. The crystals are definitely the MacGuffin of the game, and the early Final Fantasy titles did rely heavily on the collection of crystals to represent progress through the game. Final Fantasy stories became more complex with Final Fantasy VI and VII, because they relied less on crystal collecting. The game opens with Cecil and his goon squad harassing the mages of Mysidia and obtaining the water crystal. This scene sets off a chain of events that propels Cecil into a journey of self-discovery and redemption. It was uncommon at the time, in a home console game, to see a story deep enough where characters actually grew and changed in significant ways. Cecil begins experiencing an existential crisis pertaining to his identity and the repercussions of his actions. Both he and his soldiers begin to question King Baron's orders. When Cecil directly questions the king, he is stripped of his command and punished with a lowly errand mission to the town of Mist. He is accompanied by his best friend, the Dragoon, Kain. Cecil's love interest, Rosa, is also introduced in these early scenes. The romance between Cecil and Rosa is not the single defining factor of the story, as the two are already an established couple when the player is introduced to them. It's suggested in key dialogue that Kain, despite being Cecil's best friend, holds feelings for Rosa, which are used to manipulate him along the journey. Their complicated relationship is not fully explored within the text, only being mentioned over a few lines of dialogue. These characters are all younger than I would have thought based on the art design. Cecil is 20, Kain is 21, and Rosa is 19. Upon reaching the village of Mist, the unknown package the party has been ordered to deliver is revealed to be an explosive that devastates the town and was likely intended to kill our heroes. The mist dragon that Cecil and Kain killed, the game's first tutorial boss fight, a staple of the series, turns out to be a creature summoned by the mother of a young girl named Rydia. Rydia possesses the ability of summoning, some of the most powerful attack magic in the game, and though she begins as a child with incredibly low stats, she will become a powerhouse character by the game's conclusion. These events separate our Dark Knight from his kingdom and his Dragoon counterpart, and he is now responsible for the child who he helped turn into an orphan, his guilt and remorse driving him in his transformation from a warrior of darkness to a hero of light. It is a possible criticism that Rydia so quickly forgives and places trust in the man who killed her mother and burned down her village, though it does portray Rydia as wise beyond her years as she can sense Cecil's potential humanity. The structure is quite linear for most of the game, introducing a diverse range of characters that drift in and out of your control. From the desert village of Kaipo, where Cecil fights off Rydia's would-be kidnappers, the pair travel north, encountering Tella, an elderly sage who is attempting to rescue his daughter Anna from the clutches of an evil bard. Shortly thereafter, it is revealed that Anna was not kidnapped, but rather fell in love and chose to run away with the aforementioned bard, Edward. As it turns out, Edward is in actuality the Prince of Damcyan, only disguising himself as a bard for secret liaisons between him and Anna. By the time our heroes arrive, the kingdom has already been destroyed and relieved of its fire crystal. Now, as Anna lays dying, Tella departs from the group in search of revenge. This scene includes one of the game's most meme-worthy bits of curious translation, in which Tella dubs Edward a spoony bard. A great insult for anyone you might disagree with. Edward joins the group for 2 dungeons, and is widely considered to be one of the game's most useless characters. He is even more useless in the Super Nintendo version, as his skill set has been compromised. In the Japanese version, he at least has the ability Salve, which heals the party for a small amount of HP, a semi-useful technique for such an early point in the game. This ability is removed from the American version. In both versions, he has the ability to sing, causing an enemy to possibly fall asleep, and you have to love this, a hide ability, where, because he is a coward, Edward runs off the screen for a single turn, and then is given the option to show in order to return to the battle. I actually enjoy the inclusion of useless battle options to accentuate the personality traits of our characters. This allows character development to be achieved not only through the game's script, but also through its gameplay. In addition, observant players will have already noted that Rydia has yet to learn the fire spell. It is because the traumatic event of seeing her village burn down that she has not learned it. When it becomes necessary for the party to pass an obstacle, she must overcome her fear for the sake of the group's progression. Upon arrival back in the village of Kaipo, Cecil discovers that after his departure from Baron, Rosa followed him and was injured during the incident in Mist. After a quick fetch quest in the Antlion's cave, Rosa is reunited with Cecil, and before the group travels eastwards towards Svaboul, Edward receives a scripted battle where, despite being a minor character in the game, he is able to emotionally move on from Anna's death and eventually fulfill his destined role as an NPC. Rosa is the party's white mage, and will be included during the endgame. She is best utilized in the back row with a bow or a staff. Honestly, I never knew how the staff item worked until this playthrough of the game. If you go to items during a battle, and then scroll up to the items that are equipped, and click on the weapon and use it on an enemy or an ally, it will cast a spell free of the consumption of MP, and can be used every turn. This even works for weapons that Cid will get, like the Gaia Hammer. This is very useful as a white mage doesn't have much to do when the party doesn't need healing, and it allows for some free buffs without wasting MP. In the American version, Rosa's Pray command, a healing ability similar to Edward's Salve, was taken away. This ability becomes less useful as the game progresses and her spells become more powerful, but it's still nice to have. They probably just took it out of the game because it was called Pray, and they would take out any reference to anything that could be considered religious. Cecil's starting ability, Dark, has been removed from the American version as well. This is an attack which targets all enemies on screen, but drains a small amount of HP from Cecil. This provides a useful method for clearing large groups of enemies early in the game, and also exemplifies Cecil's self-detrimental nature. The party soon encounters another playable character, a monk named Yang, a fighter for the kingdom of Fabul, where the Wind Crystal resides. Yang is a badass. In the Japanese version, his Brace command can buff his defense, and his Focus attack is a strong offensive move against a single enemy that takes an extra long time to charge. His Kick attack is a physical attack against all enemies. In the American version, his Brace and Focus attacks are removed, which is unfortunate, though I didn't find myself using them a whole lot even when I had them. Focus is a strong attack, but it takes enough time where you could have just attacked twice. Although Yang is not part of the end game, he is with your party longer than any other non-end game character, and he's one of my personal favorites as he certainly helps out in the strength department during Kane's absences. The player again fails in protecting the Wind Crystal, while the game's primary antagonist Golbez is introduced. As a villain, Golbez is a little basic, although his battle artwork still looks fantastic. He also has a really great Empire-esque theme that plays whenever he is present. Still, he is, for most of the game, a mysterious, overpowered evil dude with no clear motivation other than to do evil things because he is evil and wants more power. In a major plot twist, Kane is now working with Golbez to gather the crystals and takes out our entire party. There is a scene where Kane is attempting to kill Cecil, only to be interrupted by Rydia and Rosa. Kane proclaims, "Don't look at me," to Rosa, and Golbez questions why he hesitates. These lines first suggest the reasons behind Kane's betrayal. In this moment, Kane wants Cecil dead, but even while being mind-controlled, he does not want Rosa to think less of him. It is through his jealousy of Cecil and his love for Rosa that he is being controlled. This results in Rosa being taken away by Golbez and Kane, as the rest of the team heads back to Baron by ship to find Cid and access an airship in order to protect the remaining Earth Crystal and save Rosa. The ship gets swallowed by Leviathan, and Cecil ends up alone on the shore, yet he finds himself in a strangely familiar place. This is a trope of the series, where a major plot point happens and the party all gets split up to reunite later after facing personal challenges and hardships. We're back in Mysidia from the game's opening, and here are some fun optional scenes where Due to his behavior earlier, Cecil is turned into a frog, turned into a pig, and poisoned by NPCs. 2 more playable characters, who will only travel with the party for 2 dungeons, are introduced: Palom and Porom. These kids mainly exist to give Cecil some magical backup while he attempts to become a paladin. One of them is always hitting the other one on the head for being immature. They have a twin ability in which their turns are combined to unleash a randomized attack targeting all enemies. In the Japanese version, Palom can use Bluff to buff his intelligence, and Porom can Cry, which was thought to make running from battles easier, but actually makes stealing easier, even though you won't get a party member who can steal until over halfway through the game, and by then Porom isn't on your team anymore, making this another ability that is completely useless. Conveniently enough, Tella is reintroduced back to the team, making the lineup more magic-based during the climb up Mount Ordeals, which is a good thing because Cecil's attacks are useless against all the undead here. When the lineup changes like this, it is useful to move all the magic users to the back again. At the summit, the player is introduced to the first of the 4 fiends. These are the game's comic book-esque supervillain team, whose appearance will mark progress through each section of the game. By the time all 4 fiends have been defeated, the player will know they're nearing the end of the game. These villains don't have too much in the way of personality, but they at least give us some cool boss fights with distinct music. The first fiend is the Earth Fiend, Scarmiglian, and he must be defeated twice, so it might be a good idea to save after defeating his first form. He was called Mylon in the US version. In the following scene, Cecil faces off solo against his doppelganger in a mirrored room. It might be good to save before this fight as well. The trick to this battle, which young me was not observant enough to understand, is to read the text along the top of the screen and stop attacking, as this fight is not a winnable one. It's only by knowing when to put his sword down that Cecil can change his ways. He gets a whole new look and purpose for the remainder of the game. Another reason that I don't spend much time farming for experience points is that Cecil is returned to level 1 once his class has been changed to that of a Paladin. He receives an option to cover weaker party members and absorb the damage. He will already passively do this, though cover allows him to choose a specific ally. He also receives a few low-level white magic spells, which become rather useless by endgame. A mysterious talking light that will play a larger part in the final act of the game is introduced here, as well as the Lunarians theme, one of my favorite pieces of music in the game. Cecil's transformation from a cynical dark knight to an honorable paladin still feels like a great redemption arc to me, at least when it comes to the more simplistic nature of 16-bit RPGs. From this point on, everyone heads back to Baron as was initially planned, to find Yang also under mind control. Simply defeating him in battle will bring him back into the fold, and once again, we have a 5-person party. An infiltration mission into Baron Castle reveals that the real King Baron has actually been replaced by an imposter, the water fiend Cognazzo. Palam and Poram turn themselves into stone to save the party from a trap in another one of the game's emotional moments. Cue up the sad music. Cid joins the party in their stead, and the airship is finally obtained, opening up travel across the map and great new music. Cid's only special ability is Study or Peep in the American version, which reveals an enemy's HP and weaknesses. But as Rosa has the magic spell Libra or Scan in the American version, which achieves the same result, it is a relatively redundant ability. Cid is basically in the party to help make it through the Dark Elves' magnetic cave where no metallic weapons can be equipped. This is one of the game's more annoying dungeons because Cecil becomes useless and the party only has 4 members at this point. I put Cecil in the back and attacked with a bow, making Yang the primary damage dealer here. At this point, the player can travel to previous areas and even buy mithril equipment from the appropriately named town of Mithril, but it cannot be used in the Lodestone Cavern until the boss fight. Edward has been found injured in the castle of Troya and will never rejoin the party, but he does later play a melody that will allow the party to equip metallic equipment before the Dark Elf boss fight.
We played Dungeons and Dragons for 3 hours. Then I was slain by an elf.
After retrieving the Earth Crystal and climbing the Tower of Zot in order to trade the crystal for Rosa's life, Tella finally remembers how to cast Medio on Golbez and dies as a result of casting the spell. Cue up that sad music again. Tella's ultimate fate stands in contrast to Edward's, as he was never able to make peace with Anna's death. Edward was, and he survives. Rosa rejoins and will remain with the party throughout the game. Cain rejoins the party as well, only being the jerk that he is, will betray the party again a few dungeons in the future. The party then defeats the Wind Fiend, Barbaricia, or Valvalis in the Super Nintendo translation, by using Cain's jumping ability. Hesitating in this battle can easily get you killed. In the original American translation, Cain states that he wanted to keep Rosa close to him, while in the translation in the patch that I'm playing, it is worded that he desired to keep Rosa for himself, emphasizing that his jealousy had caused him to fight against the team. The Final Fantasy series is certainly no stranger to the love triangle subplot, though it's handled with the appropriate amount of subtlety here. Soon after these reconciliations, Rydia is found underground, and since being swallowed by Leviathan and living in the land of summons, where the progression of time is different, she has grown into a young woman. Her portrait and battle graphics are upgraded, and she will also be with the party for the rest of the game. Hell yes. The world map music for the Underground is fittingly changed. The residents here are all dwarves who like to say lally-ho, a variation of the hunter's cry tally-ho. This is a much smaller world map than the surface and contains two optional areas, the Land of Summons and the Sylph's Cave. Yang will later sacrifice himself to save the party in the Tower of Babel, only to be found alive in the Sylph Cave, though he will not rejoin even after being hit on the head with his wife's frying pan. Cid also sacrifices himself, only to be found still living in the Dwarf Kingdom, though he will never rejoin the party for battle purposes. They even do a fake-out death scene. Like, they admit they know they're going way over the top with so many sacrifice scenes. All of this brings us close to our final party lineup, with only one member yet to be introduced. Edge is introduced later in the game, and I feel his inclusion is simply because the game designers wanted to include a ninja. I would have been just as happy to have Yang fill the final slot in the party's endgame lineup, but Edge does have some useful attack magic. His personality is that of a wisecracking, rebellious youth. It's loosely implied that there's some kind of attraction between him and Rydia. He is 26 years old, and Rydia is 7 when the game starts, though she grows old faster in the Land of Summons, hopefully making their ages a lot closer. This addition to the lineup makes Cecil and Kain the primary attackers, with Rosa as the white mage, Rydia as the black mage, and Edge possessing a balance of attack and black magic. He also has a steal command, which rarely works and can only steal first-tier items. Because of his delayed arrival onto the team, stealing is not as integral a part of gameplay as it is in later Final Fantasy titles. At least this means I don't have to draw out battles spamming steal over and over again while the rest of my party defends, just because I don't want to pass up on a unique item. Edge also has a throw command, but since the weapon is consumed after being thrown, I rarely use it. This command can become overpowered if the player utilizes the duplication glitch in the original release to create 99 of any weapon. This brings us to the dungeon I wasted the most time in, the Tower of Babel. I could see a chest on the other side of a wall, but I knew I had to use the stairs to get there, and searched endlessly for them. It turned out that the chest could only be obtained after leaving the tower, returning to the surface, using the airship to pick up the land speeder, which you haven't even used since Edward was in the party, and after carrying it to another continent and fighting through a cave, meeting Edge, who takes you back into the previously inaccessible area of the tower, and then it turns out the item was a potion. The item was a potion. Even though all of this sounds very frustrating, it's also what I love about old school JRPGs. I suppose I must be something of a masochist to play these games. After you get revenge on the fire fiend Rubicant for turning Edge's parents into monsters and forcing him to kill them in battle, it's time to pray for a robotic whale to rise out of the ocean so we can all fly to the moon. The final act of Final Fantasy IV incorporates more science fiction elements into its medieval fantasy setting when it's revealed that Cecil's father, Kluya, was a Lunarian, an ancient race that inhabited the moon. And in a Star Wars style reveal, Golbez is actually Cecil's brother. Cecil and company are given this exposition by an old man who is really more beard than man, living in a castle on the moon named Fusoya. He is the last character to join. He fills in Kane's spot for just one dungeon while Kane is on another betraycation. Best friend my ass. Fusoya, like Tella, has a ton of spells but low magic points. After flying back to the planet, the party will fight its way through a giant robot, complete with a boss rush at the end. It did actually kick my ass once, as I just wasn't prepared for it. On a side note, the concept art for the Giant of Babel is similar in design to the summon Alexander from other games in the series. As far as endgame content, there are a few side quests that will obtain more summons for Rydia. I love these because of their hidden nature, branching off from the linear progression of the main game. The Land of Summons and the Sylph Cave have hidden enemy-free areas which are fun to discover. When I first played this game as a child, I didn't understand that you had to cast the spell Float in order to not take damage in either of these areas, resulting in a much greater challenge than was necessary. I would burn through my MP using cure spells and run from most battles. Now that I understand how to play through these dungeons, I find them to be considerably more enjoyable. The Sylph Cave has Marlboro enemies, which Final Fantasy players know can hit you with all kinds of disgusting status ailments, as well as the damn Toad Masters, who can use their toads to turn you into a toad. The method I used was to turn them into a toad, so that they could no longer tell the toads to turn me into a toad. Another difficult area is Bahamut's Cave, where the party encounters behemoths on specific floor tiles. These are one-time battles, but each time they nearly defeated me. I was only able to defeat Bahamut with blind luck, as Kane happened to be in the air when it used its Mega Flare attack, allowing me to revive my characters and barely obtain a victory before it used it again. I suppose I could have made all of this easier by stopping to level up, but I felt like playing in a way where I could reach the end as quickly as possible. By the time I went after the Odin summon in the basement of Baron Castle, that fight was laughably easy, and in a twist, it turns out that Odin was the real king of Baron. His summon is supposed to automatically kill everything on screen except for bosses, although it never works for me. Oh well. Depending on which translation you're playing, it's mentioned that Cecil and Kane were orphans raised by King Baron. Edge and Rydia are both orphans as well. Rosa's mother is alive in the town of Baron, though she has lost her father, meaning that the final endgame party is a group comprised mostly of characters without family who find family in each other. Final Fantasy III introduced the class of Summoner to the series, with 8 summons available, which all have continued throughout the series. These powerful magic attacks draw inspiration from various religions: Hinduism with Shiva, Islam with Ifrit and Bahamut, Norse myth with Odin, and Greek myth with Titan. Leviathan has been mentioned in both Judaism and Christianity. Ramu is not attached to any specific theology, but he's basically a god of lightning. And Chocobos are a mascot of the Final Fantasy series, though they're usually the weakest summons. Given the removal of religious language in the English translation, it's surprising they didn't change the names of any of these summons. FF4 adds 3 new summons: the Mist Dragon, which is the first boss fight, as well as the Indic entity Asura, who will randomly cure, protect, or raise the party, and Sylph, which is basically a fairy creature that will heal your party as well as damage one enemy. I could have spent the same amount of time as I spent playing the entire game, to get all of Rydia's secret summons: Goblin, Cockatrice, Bomb, and Mind Flayer. Each of these enemies has a 1 in 64 chance of dropping an item that will allow Rydia to learn their summon. However, none of these summons are very powerful. I've seen message boards where players talk about spending 6 hours to get the Goblin summon, which is the game's most useless summon, or 10 hours to get a Cockatrice. I could have, like a madman, obtained these at the beginning of the game, but I would have been so over-leveled that it would completely destroy any challenge. At the end of the game, I repeatedly fought battles, but eventually grew bored with it. This is like the original loot box, only you're gambling with your time instead of your money. There is a method to accomplish this, though. There's an item called Siren that will force a battle with a rare enemy. Sirens can be stolen from the security eye enemies on floor 7 of the Tower of Babel or in the Giant of Babel. The strategy is to steal 99 sirens, store them, then steal 99 more so you have plenty. But in the version I'm playing, you can buy them from the Hummingways on the moon. After that, you have to farm at specific spots and reload if you use too many sirens. Even if you can guarantee a fight with a specific enemy, it's still a 1 in 64 drop rate, but it helps. I don't think this works for the grenade enemies on the moon if you're looking for the bomb summon, though. There is some debate as to the exact RNG of these drops as well. There's also an extremely rare item to mention: the infamous Pink Tail. Another 1 in 64 chance item drop, this time from an extremely rare enemy called a Pink Puff or a Lady Flan, depending on the translation, in a single room of the game's final dungeon. It can be traded for the Adamant armor, the best armor in the game. I've never put the effort into getting this item, although with a healthy supply of sirens, plus save states, and speed boosting, it might be a more tolerable experience. I will mention here my love-hate relationship with the Final Fantasy series' more insane completionist activities. There always seems to be some item with an incredibly low drop rate from a rare battle, meaning you'll have to walk back and forth in classic JRPG fashion for hours on end, mashing the same button over and over to quickly get through the battles or just running away. It can become a tedious chore if you let it, and I judge the time I will spend doing this against the in-game benefits of whatever is obtained. I will inevitably stop playing this game to move on to another, at which point the benefits of the in-game item become obsolete within the broader perspective of my actual life. My life being built upon periods of time which should not be wasted, unless I'm enjoying myself while I'm wasting them. At least this is what I tell myself, because I'm still trying to jump rope my way to the Hail to the King achievement in Final Fantasy IX. I did experience the Easter egg in the hidden developers room that was removed from the American game. I couldn't find this area until after I beat the game, because I kept walking by it in the Dwarf Kingdom, but once you get past the drunken, dancing dwarf in the pub, there's a secret room where the characters are named after people who worked on the game. The game's director, Hironobu Sakaguchi, is depicted as a chocobo. There are even random battles against people who worked on the game in monster form, and a composer's room. There's a secret item here that is a pornographic magazine you can collect that bears the simple description, Lustful Lally-Ho. This is the reason the whole section was originally removed in America, even though it's only text. It's still fun to see it here. At this point, and during many other times in the game, I ran out of inventory space. Early in the game, the player must use Geisal greens to summon the Fat Chocobo in Chocobo forests around the map. I have the bad habit of hoarding items, equipment, and money in RPGs. I usually don't sell off my old equipment like I probably should. I use items as little as possible, and conserve money whenever I can. This means that I spend a large portion of play scrolling through menu screens managing inventory. If I have to trash an item, I want it to be an item I can easily replace, though sometimes I trash my Phoenix Downs or tents in the middle of a dungeon and then can't revive my characters or heal at save points. This is a very stupid way to play the game. Rosa is the only full-time character who can cast Raise, so if she gets KO'd, Phoenix Downs are a necessity. Likewise, tents and cottages are needed to recover MP, as ethers in early Final Fantasy games are usually expensive. Although by the time you get to the moon, Edge can steal ethers for the party. One thing I love about Final Fantasy is that you can talk about ninjas stealing ether on the moon, and it makes complete sense. From saving my money, I finished the game with over 2 million gil. There's absolutely no point in holding onto equipment for characters who will never rejoin, yet I held on to all of it anyway. By the time I had reached the moon and could access the Fat Chocobo in my whale ship, even the Fat Chocobo had run out of inventory space. Luckily, I was so close to the end of the game there were not many more items to collect. I also held onto numerous battle items, completely unaware of their uses. I would later discover most of them have the same result as a spell you already have at your command. These weren't in the US version I grew up with, so I played the game as if they weren't even there. Several of the late-game dungeons have a running theme, such as the trap doors in the sealed cave that require a fight nearly every time you walk through a door, with many of them containing absolutely nothing on the other side. And the final dungeon, officially dubbed the Lunar Subterrane, littered with important treasure chests that trigger difficult fights. This area will provide you with upgraded equipment for your whole party, and it's important to explore every screen fully. I traversed this dungeon at least 3 times in my attempt to finish the game. The Red Wings theme is brought back, but given the heightened stakes, achieves even greater levels of intensity here. The music changes again in the second half of the dungeon. In this portion, every fight utilizes boss music, ramping up the tension in anticipation of the game's conclusion. Nearly every fight is with a death mask that casts wall on itself, eventually reflecting wall back on your characters, preventing you from using healing spells on yourself. You can use healing spells on the death mask, which will be reflected back, but you can't control which character will receive them. There is also no way to warp out of the dungeon from this point on, and there's no turning back from here for the sake of this review as well. It's something of a letdown that there's no final battle with Golbez. The first time you encounter him, you fight Kain instead. The second time, it's a scripted battle with Tella. And the third time, in which Rydia rejoins the team, Golbez is defeated, but not killed, and in a weird moment, his severed hand crawls across the floor and takes the crystal anyway. Golbez realizes the error of his ways in the end, and assists you in a confrontation with the final boss, Zemus. Zemus, a Lunarian who considers his race to be superior, has been the one manipulating the minds of Kain and Golbez throughout the game. He transforms into Zeromus, an embodiment of hatred, who, as your party floats through space, uses attacks called Big Bang and Black Hole. Zeromus' attacks might be more interesting than he is. He really does come out of nowhere in the last 30 minutes of a game that took me over 20 hours to finish. The ending itself is substantial for a 16-bit game. Golbez and Fusoya are about to depart for a long sleep. Cecil is about to let his brother leave forever without saying anything, but because of his teammates' encouragement, he gives a brief goodbye. A man of few words, it seems. There's an interstellar prophecy scene, and then a big happy ending that ties it all up with the marriage of Cecil and Rosa, which includes the return of all of the major surviving characters, except for Kane, who stands brooding atop a mountain with his helmet off. You have to love that we only see the back of Kane's head. Such a mysterious dude. The final battle involved some challenge for me at level 50 or so. I had not even obtained all of Rydia's black magic yet. Once I finished the story, it seems rather a waste of time to go back and level my characters up more, especially for a 30-year-old game with no online elements. For me, the enjoyment of a game like this comes from the progression of the story, though there is still more game here than story. The bulk of playtime is spent in battle, lost in dungeons, and in menu screens sorting equipment. Once the story is finished and I have no more room for items even in storage, it seems pointless to monotonously fight through battles just to get a few extra spells that I didn't even need to win against the toughest enemies in the game. At this point, there's no more challenge, and it's time to move on to the next game. Though I find no fault in gamers who love a game so much that they will level up every character to 99. I can be one of those crazy gamers, although I think it's healthier for me to just move on with my life. So that's what I'm doing. I'm moving on with my life. The Final Fantasy series is one of my favorite video game series, and there are few games in that series I hold in such high regard as Final Fantasy IV. It's the game that introduced me to RPGs. It taught me how to build a diverse team and manage different personalities in order to achieve success. And also that a video game could contain the same level of depth as a fantasy novel, with the interactive element making it even more immersive. Final Fantasy IV is a masterpiece. A 10 out of 10 for sure. Maybe one day I'll come back to it and grind for that sweet, sweet goblin summon.